All right, welcome everybody. I want to make sure the mic is working. So welcome to Interpret America 6. I'm Catherine Allen, and I'm co-president along with Barry Slaughter-Olson of Interpret America. And we are essentially an organization dedicated to raising the profile of interpreting, and that is the role we're playing today. I want to welcome everybody here on site. I think when people didn't believe us that we didn't have room for on site, now they understand we really did have a limited space. But we're really happy to announce that we actually have the same amount of attendance as previous summits. There are 100 people attending online, and many of whom will also participate in the work group. So we have 2/3 of our audience is actually online, and this is truly a tech conference in all senses of the word. We want to thank all of our sponsors, some of whom you'll hear from in just a moment, for making this possible. And Barry will have to switch out of one screen and get into another so we can show our sponsors. These are the tech platforms, really, that are some of the most important tech platforms that are making remote interpreting possible. And they have made this conference possible. So we always want to acknowledge them and thank them for their generous support. And with that, we are going to give our venue and flagship sponsors a minute each to come up and introduce themselves and say who they are. And we're starting with Laura Buryan from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And she will have to, I think there's a pathway if you go
I would suggest that you probably go around.
You have to go around and you'll see. So those of you who are attending online, welcome. And you're probably breathing a sigh of relief that you have lots of room to stretch and move because we will be tight today during our summit. So Laura is going to come up and talk to us a minute about the Middlebury Institute.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see our offices being so full. I had to walk out in the hallway in order to get through the room. So my name is Laura Buryan. I am a professor of Chinese English interpretation at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And I've been there, graduated from there in 95, and I've been teaching there since 2000. So I'm of the old cadre. I am speaking on behalf of our Dean, Renee Gersheny, who extends her greetings to everybody here. And thanks you for being part of the conference. We are on the screen, but we're not a tech company. We are indeed a graduate school with masters in conference interpretation, translation and interpretation, translation, and translation and localization management with 3 tracks in translation, localization, and management. So we've got lots of subspecializations within. And you probably are going to be hearing soon, also launching a search for a new dean. Dean Gershany's term is up, and she has been amazing, continues to be amazing, and is helping to see us through finding a successor. We are also launching a search for a new dean of international policy management. And so we have a lot going on. And we have created a new position of chair of translation interpretation. I'll be assuming that chairship in January. So I look forward to talking to anybody who may have any interest in learning more about what's going on there, but we're thrilled that you are here. Thank you.
And I want to thank the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. They were our very first sponsor, I believe, way back in 2010 for the first summit and have been with us since the beginning. Now I'd like to invite another person who has been with us since the very beginning up to talk for a minute, Kristen Quinlan from Certified Languages International. And I think you can sneak around.
This is easy. I just feel like my head's right in the middle of the camera shots. Anyways, I'm the CEO of Certified Languages International. We found out about, I was introduced to Barry and Catherine at the beginning of their first summit year and glommed on because I thought it was pretty cool that there were 2 people up there that were interested in talking about the professionalism in the profession and furthering the visibility of interpreting. And so we sponsored them, not really knowing anything about it. And we've been with them ever since. And I can't tell you how much I value this organization and what they have done for us as a company and the interpreters at large as well. And bringing us all together at the same table is so critically important. And today I think we're going to find that we're going to make a lot of headway in joining unions and forces and making sure that we're all working together to continue the good viewpoint of interpreting. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. And our flagship sponsors and the venue sponsors are the ones that really dug into their pocketbooks and gave us a significant amount of support so we could do all of this playing with technology. So we really thank you. We now would like to bring up Kate Miller of Headbox, and she will also have to run the gamut of the room. One of our three flagship sponsors, and she will come up and give you a little bit of a statement about Headbox. Thank you so much. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Catherine and Barry, for having us all here. Good morning. I have to read off of this. We changed it several times. Sorry. As you know, my name is Kate Miller, and I started the Headbox here in the U.S. recently. And Headbox is based on 30 years of LSP worldwide experience, and Derek and his team started developing the Headbox app for RSI because customers wanted something like a new tool they could use as short for the time they needed it for wherever they are. This is why we are hard at work making our apps professional, simple, intuitive, pleasant to use, and compatible with existing interpretation conference equipment. We don't want to send booths to the museum. We prefer to open their doors up to the world. Our first years of experience, we knew that RSI will not replace traditional on-site work. It will just bring many more opportunities through yet unknown uses. And we want to be the company that will help those new opportunities become reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you very much, Kate. And finally, we have Didier Rosset from Televic, who is going to have the biggest challenge getting out of his chair because those tables may need to be adjusted a little bit so we can come on out. Thank you, everybody. And thank you very much for sponsoring. Here's Didier.
Hi, my name is Didier, product manager for a company, Televic, and based in Belgium. It's kind of surprised that I'm here, but I didn't know that I should take the floor. Televic Conference is a Belgian-based company that is actually providing conferencing equipment. In 2016, we launched our award-winning new interpreter station, and I'm actually thrilled to be here today to kind of work together with end users for us and to see how we can bring it to the next level and certainly learn a lot about remote interpretation and what it brings to the industry in the future. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And for those of you who are interested in these platforms and companies, and for all of our sponsors who are listed outside and who you'll be seeing throughout the day, take a moment to talk with them and find out what they're doing and thank them for supporting the event. All right. So last but not least, before we launch in, we definitely want you to follow us on social media. For everybody here and everybody following online, our hashtag is at InterpretAmerica. No, our Twitter handle is at InterpretAmerica. Our hashtag is InterpretAmerica6. And it looks like our Facebook page is just Interpret America. It's covered up. I did want to point out we have this gentleman, Marcus McCoy. You can stand up for a minute. He is our social media manager today. We, through our sponsorship, are able to have an official social media manager. He will be taking pictures and doing Facebook live videos and tweeting and Facebooking up a storm. So we just want to spread the word out during the event. We know we have a lot of people following us around the world. And now, without further ado, we are going to dive into our framing. Oh, I have one more slide. Just to reiterate what we have going here, we have on-site, we have about 55 people here on site. Yeah. And you feel every one of you in the squeeze in the room. We have 3 separate kinds of participation this year. We also have a full online participation. This is a working conference. And soon after we do our plenary session and panel, everyone will be in work groups working and really trying to tackle this issue of remote interpreting. And it was a crazy idea, but we said, let's use one of these new video platforms where you can do breakout rooms and actually hold meetings over an online platform. And so we also will have 6 online work groups with 45 people, I think, attending online. So we will have 12 work groups in total when we get to that, and their participation is completely like yours, except that they can't have lunch with us. And then we also have a plenary live stream. I think we have another additional 50 people who are coming in for the plenary sessions, and maybe will be hanging out with me on Facebook Live at 12:30 Eastern Daylight Time. And so we've just really tried to make the conference accessible because this topic is so important to everybody in the field, and we want to get as much input as we possibly can.
Yeah, I would just add really quickly, we were at ATA on Saturday where we were able to have a session with interpreters and attendees at ATA. The room was packed, and it was so loud as they were talking about these issues that they came over from the other side of the air wall and said, could you guys keep it down, please?
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea of how interested everyone is in this topic.
All right. So now we are going to go into our framing before we move on to our panel. And just briefly, and I'll start off and Barry will take it from here. So really, what is the big picture for today? The big picture is that we really are, all of us right now, living at a time when we have this pace of monumental change, right? It's a speed that we've never seen before in all areas. So you could be a lawyer, you can be a taxi driver, you may now be a Lyft driver, and you used to be a taxi driver. You can be any kind of profession, and your field is flipping. So we're all faced with this reality of sort of 24/7 connectivity and 24/7 communication in all sectors and areas. And it's not just us that's dealing with this, but the context in which we work, the people we work for, the places we work is changing and adapting and moving. And we have to understand where we fit into this changing context. We're not an isolated field, right? So if the context in which we work is changing radically, then we can expect that the context in which we work is also changing radically, because everybody needs to communicate, and we work in all these contexts. And that, I'm going to hand it over for Barry to take it home to finish the framing, and then we will move on to the panel. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much.
So as I get my notes together here, and I have to come down just to make sure that everybody can hear me and I fit in the frame. So I want to just continue to give you an idea of what brings us all here today. And I think we need to understand that in order for remote interpreting to actually move forward successfully, and so that all of the interested parties can actually be happy, right, and it can work, there are 4 elements. And they're like the 4 legs of the stool that you see here on the screen. Obviously, you've got to have the technology. And for many years, the technology just wasn't there. And I think that often we as interpreters were very happy in saying, yeah, it's coming, but the tech just isn't there yet. And we were like, oh, it's not there. That's good. Let's keep doing things the way we always have. Well, it's now here, and it's only improving. To think that we would be able to do this 8 years after the first InterpretAmerica Summit boggles the mind, really, with what we're able to do with cloud computing and the internet and broadband access. The end users have to want it, and we know they do. They're asking for it. I encourage all of you, we have people from all of the specialties of interpreting. We have court, community, medical, and conference, all here in business interpreters. We have companies that are hiring interpreters for that. We have interpreters that are working in these spaces. Talk to each other, and you'll find out that you're all getting these requests. It's not an isolated thing. Then you also have, of course, the interpreters. We have to be on board to say, yeah, we're going to do this. We're comfortable with this, and this can be a way for me to work professionally and make a dignified living. And there are questions around that, and we're going to get to some of those today. And finally, you've got the LSCs, the language service companies. Some might think we don't need them. In fact, I've heard that quite a bit from a number of my colleagues. They can just hire us directly. If you think about the volume of work and what it's going to take to actually make this happen, without the language service companies, this will never happen. So those 4 legs have to be firmly in place. So let me talk a little bit about existing standards and codes. The professional associations that are out there, and I haven't listed all of them, but these are 3 that have worked and have something in their professional code of ethics regarding remote. They've worked very hard for many years, and gratefully, those of us who are in this profession today benefit because of the hard work of these organizations. And we also have ISO and ASTM, two standard-setting bodies that have been working and have published, in some cases, standards on remote interpreting. Now, all of this work is of great importance, and it is something that we desperately need. But there is something that we've clearly observed. The standards are out of date, and the codes are out of date. And it takes quite a long time in the existing standards processes to actually keep up with the pace of technological change that we are living with every day. We have received multiple calls this year from people saying, do you have any kind of standards whatsoever for medical interpreting or for remote simultaneous interpretation? Are there any standards that we can refer to? Now, there are some very specific standards for certain kinds of implementations, but again, things are changing so radically that that's only one small slice of the pie. So our effort today in this meeting is to try and fill a gap and to find a way that we can contribute and we can get meaningful commentary, meaningful ideas down on paper, taken down to then put into a report. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in order for us to face the pace of innovation, we may need to think how it is that we can complement those processes that have been in place for decades. So having said that, we kind of see this meeting as a stepping stone. It's not a be-all, end-all. It's an experimentation, and it's an effort to try and get our minds wrapped around this change that is taking place across the board. We have a window of opportunity. This window of opportunity isn't going to remain open forever. The technology is still in its infancy. It is changing rapidly. And the technology developers are willing to work with all of the parties involved to find right solutions to make this work. This window will not remain open forever. There may be other windows in the future, but we need to take advantage of this window now. Some of you may have seen this before in other presentations that I've given, but we feel it's important for us to frame. We have a lot of people from across the interpreting spectrum in this room today. And frankly, as I look out at this expertise, I am in awe, really, because I don't think we've ever had this kind of brain power for interpreting, let alone remote interpreting, in one room to discuss this issue that we're all facing. So the thing is, we all bring our own experiences, and it's a little bit like the blind man and the elephant, right? We're all touching different parts of the remote interpreting elephant, and we think we understand it pretty well. But the thing is, the way we see it isn't the way that everybody else is seeing it. So today, in addition to sharing your knowledge, I encourage you to open your ears and listen, really listen. Because if you do, you're going to walk away from this meeting knowing so much more than I think you really ever imagined, and establishing connections that are going to help you as you continue to work to address this challenge and wonderful opportunity that we have before us. So just quickly to help this be understood, and this is something that I live and breathe this every day, and I'm constantly reminded that I need to explain and define terms, even for this room, because remote interpreting for you means one thing, but the person sitting next to you may be thinking it's entirely different. So there are basically three flavors, and I love chocolate, so I like to say chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla, right? Those basic ones, right? And we have video. Let's start actually with over-the-phone interpreting, OPI, that's been around for the longest, right? It is at scale. It has grown. It's going through growing pains. It's continuing to expand and is desperately needed. That's over the phone. Then you have video remote interpreting, which is now being introduced in many medical settings and also in some court and also in conference. But the difference is that with over the phone and video remote interpreting, when we think of those, we normally think consecutive, right? Because it's consecutive, it's dialogue interpreting most of the time. Then you have remote simultaneous interpreting, which has appeared in recent years because of the technology explosion. And this makes it possible now to offer remote simultaneous in multiple languages in many different ways. So these are the three basic flavors. You have OPI, you have VRI, and then you have RSI. I would encourage you to use these acronyms. We're starting to get a meta language around this so that we can talk about it and understand what we mean. We're not talking past each other. Let it be known that there are more than three flavors. In fact, I would probably say there's a lot more than you would find at Baskin-Robbins, right? With different kinds and iterations of OPI, VRI, and RSI. But I don't want to get into the weeds now on that. So I need to go back one. Did I jump? Oh, sorry. Okay. This is what I've been feeling, and I know Catherine has for quite a while as we've been working on this meeting. A goal should scare you a little and excite you a lot. We are so excited to have you all here. What we hope to do as we move through today and then on into the drafting of the written white paper that will be published and given back to the profession, to the industry, so that people can have access to what we have talked about and in a very digestible and understandable form. That is our goal. And we hope to encourage in each of you a desire to get involved, a desire to collaborate, and a desire to maintain contacts and dialogue with stakeholders in this area. Because we have the opportunity to see tremendous growth in our profession, and most importantly, the opportunity to help the world communicate better like never before. And that is what's most exciting. And we're at the panel, so we're going to move on now here, and I'm going to ask my Mark to actually come up and assume his place of honor. Okay. And I need to watch my time. Oh, we did pretty well. So as Mark is making his way up here, a little bit like a salmon swimming upstream, we're going to go ahead and just give you a quick framework. I got to pull out my other docs here. Here we go. And as we get ready for the panel, Noah, I need to ask you to go onto the computer there, and I need you to open the video of both Claudia and of Donald Tate. Claudia Brouwer is joining us from Florida. Donald Tate is joining us from the European Commission headquarters in Brussels. So they should be coming up here. And what I'm going to do is, let me go ahead and just end our web share here so that we can get them up on the screen. Escape. Okay. And are you seeing where to do that, Noah? Are you still looking? Okay, I'm going to let him go ahead and work on that at the moment, and I'm going to introduce some of our panelists. This panel is going to be a bit unorthodox. It's not going to be, okay, I'm giving you 10 minutes, go ahead and give your spiel, 10 minutes, next spiel. We really want to have a conversation. And one of the good things about this is we want to open up the opportunity for interaction. You'll notice that we have conference mics that are on each of the tables. There is a button in the lower right-hand corner where it says mic on off. If you do have a question, you can raise your hand. We'll get through the first round here, and if you've got some questions that you would like to ask our panelists, you can do that, and I'll recognize you. You turn on the mic, and we'll be able to hear you, and everyone out all over the world that's listening will be able to hear you. So, Claudia, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
And I'll quickly ask Donald, can you hear us okay?
Yep, I can hear you all fine.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. We're going to get your video up here on the screens. I know Noah's working on that, but let me go ahead and just introduce our panelists quickly. So to my immediate right, we have Mark Gersheny, who is a seasoned simultaneous interpretation and audiovisual technician with decades of experience working in the international organizations, both within the UN family and currently with the World Bank. And Mark has a great deal of knowledge when it comes to the high end of equipment and making remote interpreting possible at those kinds of international organizations. So Mark, it's great to have you here. Next, we have Lorena Ortiz Schneider, who is an interpreter she owns her own company. She works in the judiciary. She is very active in California with the California Workers' Comp Interpreters Association. I bet some of you are probably thinking, wow, I didn't even know that existed, but it does, and they are doing some amazing work. And Lorena is going to be able to speak from a practitioner's point of view about the good and the bad of dealing with remote interpretation in those settings where she works. And then next to her is Angelica Villagran. And Angelica is the VRI, is it administrator or coordinator? Supervisor, one of those important words. The VRI supervisor at Stanford Healthcare. And she knows a lot about implementing remote video medical interpreting because Stanford's been working with it for years, and she has a wealth of knowledge about what works and what doesn't, and what doctors like and don't, and what interpreters like and don't, et cetera, et cetera. She is a veritable gold mine. It is great to have you here, Angelica. And then next to her, we have Brian Forrester. Brian is the CEO of a company called BoostLingo. BoostLingo is a cloud-based, basically a software company that is making it possible to offer VRI and OPI in new ways using apps and making it available without having to invest heavily in infrastructure. So they are representing the other end of the spectrum, not the high-end hardware-heavy area, but the area where it's almost all in the cloud, and they're making use of devices like these little smartphones and tablets and computers to be able to connect people or interpreters to people who need their services. It's a really interesting model, but that's not what I'm here to talk to you about, so I encourage you to talk to him when you have the chance. And then online, how are we doing video-wise? Any luck, Noah? Okay, so everybody else should be able to see them, but we're not able to for some reason. So at least we've got your voices here. Quickly, I'll introduce Claudia. Claudia is a seasoned interpreter and interpreter trainer, but she has taken a very different route than, say, me, where I work at a graduate level program. Claudia has worked to train interpreters who are looking to get in to OPI and VRI, that are looking to find a way to leverage their skills so that they can have a source of income and combine it with a lot of other responsibilities that they may have. And that is a huge part of what interpreting is today, particularly in the OPI and VRI space. And so she has a wealth of information about that as well, and has been giving webinars and training sessions for many years online to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interpreters that were looking to get trained. Donald Tate is from the European Commission, and he is responsible for organizing, I would say, the lion's share, and if I get that wrong, Donald, you'll jump in and correct me, but the lion's share of the remote interpreting assignments that are scheduled each year in the European Commission. And remote interpreting for them, again, is not what remote interpreting is for Stanford Healthcare or for other areas. So we're going to learn a little bit more about that. So those are our panelists for today. And I want to kick it off with just a question to each of the panelists, and I'll mention your name and say, okay, I'll hand it over to you. So first off, here's the question. Remote interpreting, threat or opportunity? Angelica. And if you'd go ahead and turn on your mic.
Well, it really depends on when you ask me that question. If you had asked me that question in 2009, I would have said it was a threat because I was a medical interpreter and I didn't understand much about video interpreting. Now I tell you it's an opportunity after crossing that border, let's say. It is an opportunity because we get to many, many more patients through remote interpreting than we do in person. When I was an interpreter, I didn't understand that, and I thought I will lose a connection with my patients because I will be removed from the room, but really the connection should be between the patient and the provider. So being removed is actually good. Thank you.
I'm sure that could be considered a little controversial among some. We'll probably get back to that. Let's keep going. I'm actually going to ask Donald, if you'd like to answer that question, remote interpreting, threat or opportunity?
Hi, everyone. I think I would very much agree with what Angelica said. Say 12 years ago, remote interpreting, we were just starting out at EU level. We had a rather disastrous experience with the first use of remote interpreting in an EU context at a meeting in the United Kingdom, where the technical setup was certainly less than what the interpreters should expect. And I think a lot of interpreters very much perceived it a bit as a threat to their profession and to the quality of the work that they do. But now in 2017, as you said yourself, I mean, we're doing remote interpretation with an enormous technical video and audiovisual setup between 2 different buildings with 27 languages and sort of 90, 100 interpreters involved. And certainly it is very much something for the future. It's an opportunity now for the interpreters. And it comes at a time when the leaders in the EU are very much looking to create a new relationship between themselves. And the remote interpreting that we do allows them to create a setup where they're sort of in private over dinner, over lunch. The interpreters are in another room. For the speakers, they are physically not in the same space, and therefore they keep that intimacy. But at the same time, we've been able to ensure that the interpreters work in very good conditions in terms of what they can see and what they can hear in the room. And I think it has to be said as well, now that we're at 28 member states, when you have a room that big with the heads of state around the table, the interpreters sometimes need a pair of binoculars to see the different speakers. Now that they're in a very special room with a very up-to-date and very modern technical setup, I think for some of them, they actually see what's going on in the room. They see the visual, the physical, the body language in a much better way than they would have if they were in the big room. Certainly, it's tiring for them. It's difficult for them. But I think the vast majority of them must see this now as an opportunity, and it's certainly something which is being asked for more and more at EU level.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Donald. I would mention, since he is connecting from the EU and they use a different conferencing system, he's had to connect using his personal laptop, connecting to the public Wi-Fi there in his office, or the office Wi-Fi. So you may have a couple of glitches here and there, but that's the reason. We just couldn't use the system there because, as you can imagine, it's such a large organization, they have everything locked down pretty tight. So I want to ask that question to one more person. Lorena, I'm going to throw it over to you because you are in the trenches. What do you see?
Thank you, Barry. Yeah, for us, it's very, very different because we are not in institutions like Stanford or European Union, etc. We are traveling interpreters. Many of the certified interpreters in the medical and the judicial space tend to live in urban areas and have to go out to more remote areas where there just aren't that level of qualified interpreters. And so we spend a lot of time traveling from place to place. I could see this as an opportunity to be able to provide access to more LEPs, limited English proficient people who are trying to access services such as medical and legal in all of the administrative hearing sessions, which include Social Security, Office of Hearings and Appeals, EDD, which is the Employment Development Department, Department of Motor Vehicles, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board, and everything that's related to all of that, such as depositions and related events, medical, legal evaluations, as well as medical treatment appointments. And it would just provide, I think for me, the opportunity is for more work for the qualified certified interpreters, as opposed to grabbing a warm body who has a bilingual attachment to them, a secretary, for example, because there is nobody to interpret. So I can see that as an opportunity.
Now, I want to follow up on that quickly because you shared a couple of photos with me last week of an iPhone sitting on a chair. Now,
That's right.
What about the risks? I mean, what are you seeing and
Yes.
what's going on?
So yes, very, very rudimentary access to VRI, so to speak. So I actually had this experience myself. There was a trial of an injured worker who had been deported to Mexico, and he was accessing the court via an iPhone and FaceTime. There were two co-defendants, actually three of them, but two of them were brothers and they were one party, the other was another party, and they were Spanish speaking. So I had to simultaneously interpret not only for the witness sitting in an iPhone right next to me, as well as the two co-defendants who were sitting over there. And how, could they hear me? Could they hear this guy on the iPhone? The claimant on the iPhone was in a space in Mexico, wherever he could get, connection. There was Mexican ranchero music blaring in the background, and kind of it's really comical, but it's sort of sad in the same way. And for me, as a working interpreter, it was very difficult. It was a three-ring circus, and of course, you're in this courtroom with judges and lawyers, and in fact, this courtroom was packed with attorneys because of the unprecedented nature of this situation. The iPhone kept dropping. It finally died. An associate had to come in with a brand new iPad that hadn't been charged. There was no charger for the iPhone. I mean, it was just ridiculous. So those are some of the kinks that obviously...
Yeah, and those things are out there. On the one hand, we have something that you're seeing at the World Bank, you're seeing at the European Commission, where the conditions are wonderful. And then you have on this other end, it's the other far end of the spectrum, and obviously it's unacceptable, but we're seeing it happen because the need is there. So what we have to do is figure out a way to move to where we can offer better conditions in all of those different areas. And so I think that's actually a really good segue for us right now. And I'd like to turn and ask Mark a question of you, and that is, so how do where do you focus your attention when you come across these different situations? Where are you putting your energy, and where would you recommend that all of these other folks that are implementing in other places, how and where should they be putting their energy?
Well, at the international organization level, it's always been about perfection in the interpretation, and the interpreters are sort of on the hook if something is dropped and the floor channel's not there and they can't interpret properly, and they know that everyone's looking at them. The pressure's on, and there's such high expectation for perfection in that medium. So in our mind, when we're about to create remote interpretation, remote SI in our organizations, which we are right now at the World Bank, we're looking at a few things as paramount. First of all, it would be the experience of the interpreter in the remote interpretation space, so that it as closely as possible mimics the booth conditions of being in a room. And in that regard, there's a lot of room for improvement, actually, because the booths, I've never heard an interpreter say that the booths are perfectly designed or perfectly placed or that they're great in any way at all. So we look at that and say, well, can we have a booth that's comfortable and climate controlled and has the kind of quietness that it requires, but maybe also improve on the monitoring conditions where the monitors are bigger and the monitors are clearer, and now we've got 4K monitors and we've got better audio than ever. So first of all, we're looking at creating really excellent conditions for the interpreters to do their work. That's a prime concern. The other concern is to really adhere to audio-visual best practices. We don't want sloppy audio. We don't want dropouts. We want clean, full frequency audio. We want great video coverage with multiple camera angles so that you can pick up body language. You can see if somebody's being sarcastic even when they're complimenting somebody. We want the overall quality to be sufficiently high enough that the work can be done at the level that the interpreters and the end users expect them to be done at.
Excellent. And I think there's some great things to pull out of that. And that's one, it's the conditions need to be there for the best service possible. Now, what you've just described, I know that many colleagues that are listening via web stream, and some of you that are in the room, that work in court and medical are just listening to this and going, if only, right? And we have to recognize that there are some things that are achieved in certain circles that may not necessarily be realistic in others. And so I'm going to move now, and I'm going to ask Buryan the same question, because you're focusing on a different space, but I know that you're just as concerned about providing the best conditions, right, for this. So how are you approaching it? Where are you putting your energy?
Yeah, well, best practices on especially video are extremely challenging. When you think about the world today, I think there's over half of the world's population has access to internet, but only about 600 million people in the world have access to broadband. And if you don't have adequate access to, a decent broadband connection, number one, it's going to present a lot of challenges. So we really look at it, at least today, to approach video specifically in a brick and mortar type of situation versus allowing interpreters to take video calls from their couch in their home, which, obviously you can train them to take video calls in a neutral background in a private setting, but there's still a lot of inconsistency with bandwidth. Even if you're using sort of the state-of-the-art technology, the typical American house doesn't even oftentimes have adequate bandwidth to have a consistent, high-quality, high-definition video stream. I think we all experience that just using FaceTime or, Skype. How many times are you on a Skype session and you're like, you're breaking up. So there's a lot of vetting and best practices we put in place to make sure that interpreters meet sort of those minimum bandwidth requirements. Otherwise, we don't take the risk of allowing them to answer, these calls at home. So even though there's a lot more access to the internet, the types of internet that you would need to have a really reliable video service, is still somewhat limited.
So your focus would be on the vetting, just to focus on making sure that the people that are on your platform are capable of providing technically the level of service that's needed.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So I think that's an interesting thing, and I want to introduce something else. And then, Claudia, I'm going to ask you a question, and that is, you have the technical side of things that you're working on, but also for someone who is wanting to provide these services from a home office, there is an onus on them as well to be able to have a place where they can work and to make sure that they have the kind of connectivity that's necessary. Connectivity that exists in many of the urban areas, I think in the United States and in many other countries. And if we were in the Nordics in Europe, oh man, wow. As well as a lot of other places in Europe now where the connectivity is simply amazing. Asia as well. So I think it's going to continue to grow, but right now we still have to vet those things, and that has to happen. So Claudia, my question for you as we transition to someone, you've been working in this remote way from home, from your home office for a number of years and been training interpreters in this. Where have you been focusing your attention to be able to provide the kind of interpreters with the knowledge that are ready to be able to tackle these new kinds of situations?
Thank you, Barry. My concern is that most of the individuals that I used to deal with trying to solve the solutions were focused on what I have heard up to now, and it's the interpreter. And I think that the focus has to be shifted now to the end user. What is it that's needed for the end user to receive the services? And the end users, just like what was mentioned a little while ago, only 600 million people have broadband. The rest are going to be dealing with cell phones. I personally have dealt with a lot of interpreters who are bilingual individuals working in small villages in Colombia, South America, with the mountains, in war-torn areas, in the middle of Africa, in countries in Russia or in India or in China. And we're forgetting that that is going to be the future. And what I have been trying desperately to teach my interpreters is that they are somehow the workers of the factories of the 80s. In the 80s, in America, we had a huge factory business, and now we don't. And that is because the human labor, the costs of human labor increased so much and could be lowered in other parts of the world. And I think that that's exactly what's going to happen to the profession unless we take really steps to focus on the end user. How is it that we are going to take this interpreting to the end user? So the way that I train people is to look beyond the technology to the technology that the end user is going to have. The cell phone is almost universally located anywhere in the world. So you are going to be able to have cell phone, not so much video. That's why I am centered a little bit more now on OPI than VRI, because OPI is still the way to go. And someone mentioned a little while ago, out of experience, remove them from the encounter. The fact that we have to teach our interpreters that they are only a link. They are the liaison. They are not the important portion. You have to learn to become invisible. So that is part of what I'm trying to teach is you do, number one, code of ethics. Number two, learn technology and become tech savvy, which is just like learning another language. That's the second stress. You don't learn technology like that. It takes the same amount of time to learn to deal with technology as it would to learn another language. So we have to start seeing learning technology for the interpreter as another language. Those are my 3 points. Tech savvy, understand that you are learning a new language. Second, be very flexible. You have to be OPI. You have to be VRI, and simultaneous is coming to phone interpreting. And number 3, remember, we in the Western world had totally different conditions than 90% of the people who today are needing interpreting.
Yeah, those are some great points. Thank you very much, Claudia. And I'd like to, if I can, riff off of one of the points that you started to get to, and you alluded to a fear that is not unfounded among practitioners and among interpreters. And that is, okay, the market flattens, what's going to happen, right? We're used to having the closed geographic markets, and that is fast fading away. And so how do we address that issue? Obviously, there's no way we're going to stop it, but it also means that there's a great risk that those who are trained and capable of doing this kind of work are simply going to say, if the market goes that flat and the rates drop below a certain threshold, they're going to look for something else. So I know that this isn't a time to get into a whole discussion of rates and all those, and that's not something that we want to do, nor should we. But how do we focus on the practitioners and help them want to do this work? And I'll actually kind of open that up to everybody. I think we've been able to go through our first round of questions, but Angelica, you've had to deal with that firsthand. What have you learned?
Well, I have learned that as long as you offer really good quality of interpretation, they really don't mind you being anywhere, on video, on the phone, or in person. They just want quality.
Right? The end clients don't mind.
The end clients, yes. As an interpreter, you do really get to a lot more patients through video, for example. Our interpreters they rotate, they do video one day and then they do in person the next day. When we compare our statistics, the in-person interpreters see around 8 to 10 patients, whereas the video interpreters are seeing 12 to 14 patients. And video interpreting tends to last longer for some reason. I don't know what the reason really is, but the providers tend to expand more when they're using a video interpreter. I think it could be that they don't see the interpreter looking through their pager because they are getting pitched out of the room, or they have a competing assignment. for video interpreters, they only focus on the one appointment they have at the time. We are on demand, so they don't know what's coming next, and they don't know that somebody else needs them after that. They just focus on the one appointment they have a task on hand. And then when they finish that appointment, another call might come in right away, or it might take 1, 2, or 15 minutes. You never know. For in-person interpreters, they already know their schedule. If a doctor is running late, they're stressed. They need to go to their next appointment. So that's why we also try to rotate the interpreters so they go through everything, not just focus on video or in person. For the end user, I think they like video interpreting now because it's on demand. It's at the click of a button. They don't have to page anybody, and they don't have to wait for anyone to come in the room. They just click and go.
Thanks for that. And I want to ask that same question to you, Lorena, because you come at it from a different place, right? You're providing these services and you're having interpreters go to these different government agencies and different places. And, as you look at the implementation of VRI or OPI or any kind of remote interpreting in these settings, of course, Angelica, she has staff interpreters, it's a large organization, and you're jumping from organization to organization to organization. What do you think it's going to take?
Yes, it's a totally different situation. It's obviously spread out, right? I'm in California, so it's a big state. But not only that, let's just say in one venue, let's say the appeals board, who's going to provide the technology? If you're in the courtroom and you have the technology set up there for a trial, that's one thing. But for the claimants who have their own attorneys, and these are very busy venues, each attorney has to confer with their client in the hallway, or maybe if they're lucky in a little conference room or outside on the street. So for me, it's like, how does that work? Who is it? The interpreter's phone that gets used? Is it the attorney's phone that gets used? Like, who gets that technology, right, that Brian's providing, for example? And then oftentimes interpreters have to help each other because they're tied up with one client over here and the other client over there needs them, so their colleague can pitch in. But then if you have just one piece of technology, how does that all work? So it's still, for me, it's still very to work out those kinks and see who's going to pay for it. Also, that's another big issue for us, for interpreters.
A big issue for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I would say in that regard.
Okay, great. Now, we've heard from the interpreters on this question. And, as I think about conference interpreters, we're, in many ways, particularly those working in the international organizations, are, if you will, in the catbird seat, because they're going to be getting and are getting at the European Commission and at the international organizations, like Mark has explained, they're getting conditions that, frankly, are wonderful and in many ways can't be beat. So the question there is, how do you continue to, or how do you branch out, right? Because what we've talked about thus far, and this is going to be a question I think for both Donald and for Mark, there are new services now, and Donald, you alluded to that a little bit, but webinars or meetings where everyone is on video, right? No one is physically in the same space, and so how do you provide that kind of interpretation, and what are the conditions that you're really going to need if you want an interpreter, say conference level, and maybe not even conference, someone who may be working in the business arena, right? How are we going to get them what they need to do their jobs? So let me go to Donald first, and then I'll hand it off to Mark.
Yeah, Barry, I think you're right. I think the interpreters that work in my organization are very privileged, and when I hear some of the stories from the other panelists, it's sort of humbling a little bit. we certainly do work with fantastic conditions here. These are conditions and specifications for remote interpreting which have been elaborated over a number of years and discussed with the representatives from the interpreters, from the users, and from our technical side. So these, I think, are things which are sort of, they're not set in stone. I think they will develop over time, but we're a very large organization, and I think naturally we will move perhaps a bit more slowly than other people who are doing remote interpretation in another context, who are perhaps able to move more rapidly and to adapt more quickly to technology. That having been said, I mean, we do have our own conformity department, we have our own technical department, we do now do webinars, we do video conference links for people. Every month we have a link between Brussels and Ireland for the veterinary inspection agency, which is based in Ireland. So rather than send our interpreters to Ireland at great expense and time, we have a link with them where we do conferencing with 5 or 6 different languages on a very regular basis. We now also do conferencing with the south of Italy for another EU agency there. So I think we are branching out, but we're doing it very slowly, and I think, as I said, we have the privilege that we have a technical department here who controls all of these things, who inspects the situation and makes sure before any of the interpreting actually happens that the conditions are there to make sure that the interpreters are able to do their job properly. But to say we are moving slowly forward, and even within the EU context where our conference remote interpreting is normally for the heads of state. Even there we're now being asked to do things. For example, we had recently a big conference in Tallinn in Estonia where the interpreters were based in one place and the actual participants of the conference moved around to different sites, and we were able to provide the remote interpretation to those different sites. And that's something that even 5 years ago would have been totally unthinkable for us. So we're being pushed a little bit on the edges as well, and certainly trying to move forward to expand where we can provide the remote interpretation, and also other different types of interpretation where the interpreter and the speaker are not at the same site.
Great. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm curious to know, Donald, if you could give us an idea of how many meetings with remote interpreting of many different iterations did you schedule last year within the European Commission?
I think we probably do maybe 10 to 12 a year. As I say, the remote interpreting that we do at high level is only for the European heads of state, so we don't do it. We have we have a document which sets out the rules, if you like, the regulations which need to be obeyed before we're even allowed to entertain the thought of doing remote interpretation, and that sets out very clearly the circumstances under which the remote interpretation can be delivered, that of course limits the areas to the meetings to which we can provide such interpretation, which is just the heads of state at the moment. And I don't think at EU level certainly that will change for the next couple of years.
Well, it's interesting. Thank you for that, Mark.
Yeah, I've got a slightly different take on it. I think as the technology's improved, and certainly the in-house technology, the internal infrastructure and the internal technology has improved for the interpreters and the clarity of the sound and the clarity of the video. But the more that the technology in the world has improved, the conditions for the interpreter have somewhat disintegrated. For one thing, that you can have now dozens people remote participating in a meeting, and whether that's WebEx or whatever it is, and from their locations, they're not on high quality microphones. They're on microphones that are attached to their computers or their cell phones. They don't know enough to turn off and mute their microphones when they're not speaking. 15 years ago at the UN, when I worked there, it was a major crime to be the technician in a room and leave even a second microphone open when somebody was speaking, because then it was picking up the air conditioning and the shuffling of papers, and all the other extraneous noise that would make it nearly impossible for the interpreters to do their jobs. And there were very few instances where the quality coming in from the field were bad, but when they were bad, they were terrible. It could be a general coming, speaking from Iraq on satellite phone, and the video and audio is breaking up like crazy. Now, though, what we're contending with is, as the previous colleague said, when you're using WebEx and all these other ways to remote participate, and there are no real best practices around it, and the quality of their peripheral gear might not be great, and the quality of their microphone technique might not be great, and the consideration given to not having a crying baby in the car while you're participating in the meeting and things like that. In some ways, that's created conditions that are worse in the international arena to do the job than it might have been just a few years ago.
It's actually an interesting comment, because those of us who work in the private sector, that happens with a fair amount of regularity. Now, even conference interpreters that are working in business settings run into those kinds of things. And I want to ask another question, because, you mentioned things like WebEx, and we've heard Skype and all of these things, but the fact is that technology was never built to actually provide simultaneous interpretation. So we're at this juncture now where you have platforms that are built for that. And so the question is, how do we get the word out there, right? How do we let people know about the tools that are available? So does anybody want to tackle that question? What kind of an approach can we take as we're trying to get the word out about, these are the conditions we need. No, Skype isn't good enough. And also understand on the flip side that there needs to be that flexibility, because having those high-level conditions that you're talking about, that leaving two mics open in the room at the same time would be considered a cardinal sin, right? But in reality, that model is never going to make it to the other areas of interpreting. I think I can say that with conviction. I don't think that that's going to happen. So how do we find those best practices for these other areas that are going to make it so that things are going to be doable, and that it's going to be good, and I hate to say good enough, because I don't want to make it sound like we're dumbing things down, because in many other places, moving up, it actually improves the standards from what people have had to work with. So we have a very fluid market from one end to the other, and we have to figure out how do we improve conditions in these other areas. And of course, we don't want to deteriorate the conditions that have been achieved at a high level in some areas, like you've just mentioned. So I don't know, Brian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So, the way I would look at it is, it's going to come down to awareness and training. And I think that's really where language service companies can play a big role in this. It's communication with the clients, on the requester side, on how to use technology, how to adopt technology, and the different options. It's interesting, Barry, at the beginning you kind of put the chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, different flavors of ice cream. We kind of look at it a little differently in terms of instead of OPI, VRI, and SRI, we look at it as on-demand OPI, VRI, scheduled OPI, VRI, or scheduled OSI.
You got vanilla swirl.
Yeah,
vanilla swirl, chocolate ripple.
Yeah, that's right. Because the way that you deliver technology for an on-demand call is a very different process than you would deliver technology for a scheduled call, especially when you talk about OPI and VRI. Typically, with a scheduled OPI and VRI call, it can be link-driven. Sort of what the speaker was talking to before, and it can be sort of this concept of a meeting room where you have multiple parties on a single call. It works a little differently in an emergency room at a hospital, right, where you don't have time to send links to 5 different parties in 5 different locations. And so the way you service that technology is a little different. But in order for there to be more adoption, it can't be a couple really large companies in the world training all these end user people. It has to come from the local language service provider who's on the ground having these conversations with their clients. That's how you're going to drive adoption, and that's where LSCs are providing such a critical role in driving technology adoption. So that's how I would look at it.
I think you've raised a really important point there, in that sometimes, and we've seen this in the past, where there's been a pretty big effort to offshore the interpreter talent, And now we're seeing it reshore, mainly for what you're mentioning, because you have to have that local connection, even though it's remote interpreting. And even though your pool of interpreters may be spread out geographically across a state or across a country, there are limits to how far those tendrils can reach out to other countries and other cultures, because there are elements that just simply cannot be ignored if you're going to provide a good service as an interpreter, particularly when it's on demand, right, where you just get parachuted in. Did you want to add something, Brian? And then
real quick, I just still wanted to add, because I know that, as we talk about the delivery of remote services, how that impacts wages is something that worries interpreters in general. And we actually think the way that you fight against that is through the LSCs. We think as LSCs adopt more technology and have access to better technology, they're more inclined to use interpreters that they're already using for on-site jobs. And they're going to be less inclined to outsource a call center in Mexico or Honduras, which ultimately harms, American interpreters. 20 years ago, it might have been 2 or 3 very large companies that were providing all remote services. And now we think because of the proliferation of technology, language service providers can control the supply chain, and they can start routing calls to their own interpreters, or creating, sort of a hybrid model where maybe they use a third party for less common languages, but for the more common languages, they route to their own interpreters. And that's going to preserve wages, we think. So just something to add to what you're saying.
Lorena, go ahead. And then I'm going to see if Claudia wants to jump in, and then Angelica.
Thanks, Barry. I couldn't agree more. I actually am an LSC on a small scale, and my challenge is bringing interpreters, as I mentioned before, into the same room. And some of my clients are very tech savvy. In fact, I've got one client that has a big screen in his conference room and uses Zoom for their communication. So I actually had a really pleasant experience. I had to bring a Mixteco Bajo, which is a Mexican indigenous language interpreter, from Oxnard, which is about 45 minutes away from Santa Barbara, to my client's office, and we connected via Zoom to their satellite office in Bakersfield, which is probably about a 4-hour drive, with the actual client and the attorney there. And so we had 2 attorneys remotely. We did the relay for the interpreting. The client got, the end user client got their language needs met, and it was a win-win for everybody. The challenge is the client education, right? How do you educate your clients that this technology exists, that it's going to make their lives easier, and therefore encourage them to actually invest in it? I think I see that as a kind of a big hurdle, at least in my little sphere of the world.
Well, the good news is that the cost of that technology is coming down, and the simplicity of using it is also increasing. And I would encourage what you've just heard from Lorena, that issue. How do we get the end users to adopt this? That's a great discussion for our coffee break, and a great opportunity for some ideas to hopefully percolate up. So Claudia, did you want to jump in on this as well?
Yes, thank you. I think that what we have heard is the absolute need for training, not for long-term education. And I know that we are in a master's degree type of environment right now, but what I am worried is all this that we have been talking, the interpreter doesn't know anything. The interpreter just basically, most of them, I would say today, start with being bilingual, even those that are entering into translation programs or interpreting programs. And what I see that is lacking is this training, short-term, absolutely oriented towards goal-oriented, to make sure that the interpreters understand that this is a reality, how to use it, where to find it, and how to solve problems. Because in the end, the technology, we can talk all we want about upgrading the technology or how it's going to be connected, but it's me with the client in the encounter who will have to solve that technical problem. And so I have to be educated as to how I will be able to solve the problem, what to tell the client, to be able to tell the hospital, could you please check the monitor? Could you please do this? Could you please do that? Because it is going to be me as the interpreter there in that encounter who will have to solve the problem. And I don't see any of that happening as part of the model of training interpreters. How do we train interpreters to become tech savvy? That would be my bottom line point.
Okay, excellent. It's good to hear that. I know that I saw some interpreter trainers and interpreters kind of shifting in their seats with some of the things that you were mentioning. And I have to admit, I was like going, oh, I think, because, you know, those are some different ideas that we have to recognize that you have a very broad set. When you're training bilinguals that are just being put to work, right? I think you're right, Claudia, that isn't there. But there is a very large cadre in certain languages of trained interpreters that do know how to work with those things. They may not know a lot about the technology, and that is an area where there does need to be training for sure. So Angelica, go ahead.
Well, I'll speak to implementing this in a hospital, because that's what I've done for Stanford Hospital. At the beginning, it was a very rocky road. It was a learning experience for all of us, providers, interpreters, for myself as a supervisor. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of teaching, a lot of learning on my end so that I could teach my interpreters how to use the system, how to bridge the gap. Like, for example, sometimes the provider's camera was closed. So it wasn't something they could open with a mouse, which they thought they could do. They really needed to physically open the little window on the top of the frame of the screen. And it was hard to explain. And we would tell them, you have to physically open it with your hand. It's not with your mouse. So there are different things that you need to learn to tell them, because if you just say unblock your camera, they keep clicking, 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 and nothing will happen. So it took a lot of teaching. I also now train the providers in clinic. So when we implement VMI, that's what we call it in our hospital, is video medical interpreting. When we implement VMI in a clinic, I'm in charge of creating the accounts for their video system. I'm the liaison between IT and the clinics, and I'm in charge of training their staff on how to use our system. One training is not enough, so it takes the interpreters also reminding them every time they connect. Please unblock your camera. This is how you do it. Please make sure that the camera is pointing to the patient and not to your forehead. Sometimes it happens. And at the beginning, when we first started, we had probably 14 calls a day. Now, this year, we interpreted 23,172 encounters for this fiscal year. So we've grown a lot. And like I said, they really like the fact that it's on demand. They like the fact that their interpreters are very well trained. They're all staff interpreters. We do everything in-house. If all of our interpreters are busy on video, then the system will roll the provider over to OPI, over the phone interpreting, which is a third-party vendor, but they will be rolled over through their computer. They don't need to do anything else other than clicking the button that says what language they need. So it's really nice and helpful. Sometimes we'll connect through video and we'll see that the patient can't hear us, or they just don't work well with interpreting through video, and we'll walk over there in person. So we do offer that option. If the appointment is really not suitable for video interpreting, maybe it's a tumor board and there are many doctors in the room, and there are relatives who are bilingual who really want to participate and they don't allow for interpretation, we'll do this in person. So there are certain appointments that we will do in person. For the most part, clinic appointments are done on video. They default to video unless they need us in person. And then most of the bedside interpretations are done through in-person interpreters.
Angelica, I hate to tell you this, but I think you've set yourself up to not be by yourself for the rest of the day. I think there are going to be a lot of people that want to talk to you.
Thank you.
With the experience that you have. But thank you for that. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to open this up for questions from our audience as well. And I'm hoping that Catherine, we're able to watch the social media feed, and if we've got any questions coming from there as well. If you do have a question, please raise your hand. Yes, in the back, make sure you turn on your microphone and try to be as brief as possible. Introduce yourself as well.
My name is Daniel. I'm a conference interpreter and a translator, and I have two questions mostly for the companies that provide the services for remote interpreting, especially RSI. How do you guys deal with latency? Because you can have all the broadband you want, but latency is always physics bound. Light will take a few seconds to travel from one place to the other, depending on the fiber optic cable. And how do you do that with going back and forth? Because you have to have simultaneous translation with RSI. And the second question is privacy. There's a website called Shodan that basically lets users browse wide open webcams that have somehow easy to guess passwords or no encryption at all, and people can just keep snooping on other people's webcams and baby cams and everything. It's pretty creepy. How do these companies treat security, and how do they ensure that communications made with a patient in a hospital setting or with a claimant in a court setting are actually kept encrypted as they should?
Brian, I think that one's in your court.
Yeah, so it's a two-pronged question, right? The first part of the question is around latency, and any tech company that doesn't say that they're concerned about latency is probably not being 100% truthful. Latency is a challenge. There's no question about it. I'll speak briefly about our technology in the cloud. We do a lot to minimize the latency that's on both sides of the wire. But especially if you're talking to somebody who's across the Pacific Ocean, it's going to be a challenge. We see that even more prevalent in video, for sure. So I don't have the best answer for you in terms of latency, other than there are diagnostic tests we do on the client side and on the interpreter side to test latency, prior to any sort of rollout. And we've actually had huge opportunities that we had to walk away from because their network was just not ready yet. Now, in terms of privacy, there's a lot you can do in terms of privacy. There's security protocols. We use very high encryption standards. And in the U.S., I'm not sure if you're U.S. based or not, but we have things like HIPAA and other regulations that, we go through annual audits to make sure that we meet all the security standards, because it's paramount that, that no one has access to those private conversations. It's partly a resource training issue too, though. You have to make sure that the interpreter has gone through the medical training as well. But from a technology standpoint, from a cloud-based technology standpoint, as long as you're making sure that, the endpoints are encrypted and the data over the wire is encrypted, you can prevent a lot of that sort of open web problem that you're talking about. But of course, nothing's completely immune to hacking, and the CIA has been hacked. So security is a sliding scale, but I think technology companies that do not have a huge focus on security do so at their own peril. Because of the liability and just the all the different problems that can happen.
Mark, go ahead. I think you wanted to add something.
So at the UN and at the World Bank and at the IMF, we're dealing with latency as well. It's obviously it's a fact. If you're going to have somebody participate from Asia, then there's going to be latency, and the signal will come in late. And I think what we want to try to do is mitigate the amount of that issue, though, to the interpreter first. And by that, I mean that, okay, the signal is going to get to the interpreter a little later and they're going to have to wait to interpret. But I'm more concerned these days with the fact that the audio and the video line up and that there's lip sync. That's very important to us right now, that the technology allows for, even if it's a little late, at least not let it look like some old Japanese Godzilla movie or something like that. So we're looking for technologies in our organizations that take that part of it seriously, where they're really thinking not only as interpreters but as audio engineers and video engineers, where things like latency, they'll try to minimize it as best they can, but not try to minimize it to the extent that the video and audio arrive at a different time. And that's something that we look at carefully when we're assessing a new technology.
Great. Thanks for adding that. We're quickly winding down our time. There are a lot of tech people here that could address that question in this audience as well. If you are, go ahead and just raise your hand so you can see some tech people. So you can see, I can see 3 others, so you can continue that conversation. Our next question, Anjali, go ahead and take the floor.
Hi, my name is Anjali Gonzalez. I'm a staff interpreter at the United Nations and also one of our focal points for a remote interpreting project that we're piloting. And our big concern at the UN is occupational safety. We already have high rates of absenteeism due to interpreters getting sick, acoustic shocks, stress, back problems, interestingly enough, from sitting down and leaning into a microphone like I'm doing right now. What kinds of, I'm sure you have something to say about this. How do you deal with occupational safety? How do you protect your interpreters? Because what IEC studies have shown is that when the quality of the audio or video worsens, the output won't necessarily be worse, but the impact on the interpreter's health will worsen. So how do you deal with that?
Angelica, I think that's yours.
We actually do ergonomic evaluations on our interpreters when they start working with us. We set it up so that it's the most ergonomically appropriate environment for them. And our desks are actually sit-to-stand desks, so the interpreters select whether they want to interpret sitting down or standing up, and we make sure that the ergo evaluator really talks to them and teaches them how to work in this environment. We also have stretching exercises for them that they can do during their breaks. And so far it's been going really well.
We are unfortunately out of time, and I knew that this was going to happen. Our time goes by very quickly, but we've got to stay on schedule. One of the amazing things I wanted to point out is we've had at least over 100 comments come through the chat. We will be able to check these at InterpretAmerica later to glean information for the report, because the chat should be saved. And we are just grateful for all the questions. I see there are so many more. The wonderful news is that we're going to be able to continue to address this in detail in the work groups. So don't think that those questions are going to go unanswered. There's a great opportunity for us to address these things. I want to thank each of our panelists, those in Brussels and Florida, as well as those here in Washington, D.C. with us, and I would ask you to please give them a round of applause. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine, who's going to explain how we're going to move forward as we get ready for our first set of work groups. I am. I've got to get that up right now.
While Barry's getting the PowerPoint up, I did want to share one comment that came in from the live stream. One model, the Healthcare Interpreting Network, which is based in California, actually links hospitals so that if a hospital one has a Spanish video interpreter that is not being used, that interpreter can serve hospital number 2 on the network. Hospital number 2 will pay hospital 1 for those services, which makes interpreter services an income generating center for the hospital. This is one of the huge issues we have in this field, is making interpreters be a cost plus, not a cost decrease, and something that Bill Rivers has talked about quite a bit. I am in my own tiny little town of 5,000 people in California. Our hospital does use this network, and they have a budget which allows them to generate thousands of dollars a year. At the very least, they pay for their interpreter services on site and online by being part of this network. So it's a model. There's a lot of interesting models that are coming out that are positive in that way. And I think we have the PowerPoint up now, so let's make sure I get this all through. I want to, for those who are online and on the live stream, at lunchtime, after we're about to go into our work group session. So for those of you who are only on the plenary live streams, we will be continuing to, pay attention to our social media streams and interacting. But at 12:30 Eastern Daylight Time, I will put my face in front of a camera and we'll do a Facebook Live for anyone who's out there, and it doesn't matter whether you're attending the plenary or not. We'll be continuing the discussion and capturing people's feedback. And will it go forward, or are you?
Trying to figure out what I did.
It looks to me like we're on a Zoom share, and maybe that's why you can't get it forward. Go. Okay, it doesn't really matter either way. I will just keep going forward on the announcements. There we go. Then we can get me to the work group sessions. We're about to go into break. And when we come back from break, we will go into our first work group session. Now, there are 6 work groups. One of the work groups is going to be in a room, so we will decrease the volume in this room a little bit. There will be a work group over there. Everybody should have received an email with who your moderator is or what the work group name is. We are going to put table tents on the table for you and come in. And so that does mean that you will be sitting probably in a different place than you are right now after break, and the break is 15 minutes. So please be aware of that. When we come back in, we're going to try and get into the work groups as quickly as we can and not waste time so you can do the discussion. I want to say that what we're doing in these work groups, this is really, why are we here? You know, why are we here for Interpret America? Half of this conference is work group. Half of this conference is actually having you sit down and bring in your expertise and insight and share it so that we can try and get out of this reactionary, just absolute kind of deer in headlights moment we've been in with our field, with the change in it and the rollout of the technologies, and see if we can come up with some answers. And so we have 2 work groups. The first one is going to be really, this is about like what is going on. This is the work group where you can vent, where you can say we're seeing all these problems, or you can say, man, we're seeing all these opportunities. We want to capture both of those. And we'll start to look at like, okay, where can we start fitting these things in, addressing them with best practices. And the second work group in the afternoon is really the nitty-gritty, rubber to the road work of trying to come up with concrete recommendations that would begin to formulate at least a statement around, this is the issue, here are some working recommendations. And our goal, and then it will be printed out as, you know, we will then write up all the feedback from the 12 work groups and what we get online and what we've got at ATDA will be put out in a report. We do have a report author. And I think, is that the next one? Yeah. So first of all, okay, I want to, we have 12 moderators. So we have a lot of people volunteering and working for us. 6 of them are in this room for the on-site. I will say their names quickly. We have Laura Buryan, Kathleen Diamond, Jaime Fatas Cabeza, Natalia Mirateva, I'm going to mispronounce it, Bill Rivers, and Dieter Runge. And so these are the people who are here in the room today who will be one of your moderators, and almost all of you received an email with that. And we will help you find your group if you can't remember anything. And online, we have Soraya Alamdari, Maha El Metwali, Gio Lester, Laura Holcomb, Ann Marks, and Cindy Rote, who have all spent time trying to figure out how to host a group in a breakout room on Zoom. So we are very grateful for them. And then also, I just want to take a moment before we break to thank the behind-the-scenes team. This includes Emily, who's not up on the screen, but our wonderful, day coordinator for all the logistics here on site. And Chris Silva is back in a room there, making sure that everything's happening on Zoom, and that I've been called back a couple times, and we're troubleshooting and making sure that the feed works out. Tracy Young, who is attending online, will author this report. And Marcus McCoy, who we already pointed out, is doing our social media. So I want to thank them. And the final thing, just for our online participants in the work groups, now is the moment for you to disconnect from the live stream and to log into your Zoom room. Please do it now at the beginning of break, because we have 45 of you to get into your breakout rooms. Otherwise, everybody here on site, please enjoy a coffee break, and we will reconvene at 11:15.
In your groups. Yes.
Thank you so much.